A poor 14-year-old boy risked his life to save an elderly woman during a flood. The next day, a luxurious black limousine stopped in front of his house, and he could hardly believe what was happening. Derek leaned against the windowsill, staring at the dark clouds rolling in over the rooftops. The sky was turning an unsettling shade of gray, and a heavy silence settled over the neighborhood. The air was sticky and thick. It was like waiting for something inevitable, a weight pressing on his chest. He could hear his mom, Marie, in the next room, rummaging around trying to move anything valuable to higher shelves. "Derek, help me with this," she shouted, her voice already tense. Derek snapped out of his daze and rushed over to help. She was struggling to lift an old wooden chair, her face pinched with worry. Derek took it from her, placing it on top of the kitchen table. The radio on the counter crackled, static cutting in and out, and a voice announced the emergency. Flood warning, heavy rainfall, evacuation advisory. Marie's fingers tightened around the edge of the counter as she listened. She turned toward Derek, her eyes tired. "They're saying we should leave," she murmured. "But we got nowhere to go." Derek nodded, saying nothing. The words hung in the air. They'd heard it before. The warnings, the alarms, the calls to leave when there was no money for a motel, no car to take them anywhere. All they could do was stay put and hope for the best. In the corner of the room, Derek's little sister, Kayla, sat with her legs crossed, playing with an old stuffed bunny. She looked up, her eyes wide and confused. "Are we going somewhere, Derek?" she asked. He shook his head, forcing a smile. "Nah, Kayla, we're staying right here. Everything's gonna be fine." He wasn't sure if he believed it himself, but what else could he say? He glanced at his mom, who gave him a faint nod, appreciating the reassurance. They both knew that lying to Kayla was easier than explaining why they had no choice but to stay. The wind picked up, rattling the windows, and rain began to pound against the glass. Derek moved back to the window, looking out at the street. The water was starting to pool in the potholes along the sidewalk, small streams beginning to form. His dad, Marcus, came through the front door, soaked to the bone, with a grim look on his face. "It's getting bad out there," he said, pulling off his wet jacket. He set it on a hook and turned to Marie. "We need to get everything we can to higher ground. This is going to be worse than last time." Marie let out a sigh, nodding, and Marcus walked over to help her move the heavier items. They didn't talk much. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said. They'd been through floods before, but this one felt different, more dangerous. Derek stood by the window, watching as the puddles outside grew larger. He couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in his stomach. He looked up at the sky, now almost black with storm clouds, and he wondered how bad it was really going to get. Kayla tugged on his sleeve, breaking his thoughts. "Derek, I'm scared," she said quietly. He crouched down beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay, Kayla. I'm right here. We're all gonna be fine," he repeated, hoping she didn't notice the slight tremor in his voice. Suddenly the phone rang. Marcus answered it, the conversation short and clipped. When he hung up, his face was hard. "That was the landlord," he said. "Wants the rent. Told him we need more time, but he's not having it. Says we're already too late." Marie's shoulders slumped. "We're just trying to survive," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Derek felt anger bubbling in his chest. They were doing everything they could, his dad working 2 jobs, his mom taking care of everything at home, and yet it was never enough. He clenched his jaw, turning back to the window. The rain kept coming, faster now, hitting the pavement like 1,000 tiny hammers. The water was up to the curb, and the street was beginning to disappear beneath a growing current. A knock at the door startled them all. Marcus opened it to find Mr. Johnson, the neighbor from 2 houses down. He was wearing a raincoat, his face serious. "Y'all need to leave," he said. "They're saying it's gonna be bad. My cousin has a place. He can take a few of us." Marie shook her head. "We can't," she said simply. "We got nowhere to go." Mr. Johnson frowned but didn't push it. He nodded once, then turned to leave. "If you change your mind, just come over," he said, before heading back into the downpour. Marcus closed the door, his shoulders sagging. He looked at Marie, then at Derek. "We're just going to have to ride it out," he said. "Do the best we can." Derek nodded again, though he didn't say anything. He looked at his mom and dad, then at Kayla, and he felt the weight of it all. The responsibility, the fear, the uncertainty. He glanced back out the window and watched as the water crept further up the street. The night settled in, dark and heavy, with the storm raging outside. Derek lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling. The wind howled, and the house shook now and then. He could hear his parents talking in low voices in the next room. He couldn't make out the words, but he knew what they were saying. Worries about the water, the rent, the future. Suddenly, there was a loud crash outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of rushing water. Derek shot up, rushing to the window. His eyes widened as he saw the street now completely flooded, the current strong and fast. Panic rose in his chest as he realized how quickly things were getting out of control. In the distance, he heard a faint voice, calling out for help. He squinted, trying to see through the rain, and spotted Mrs. Betty, the elderly woman who lived across the street. She was standing on her front porch, the water already up to her knees, waving her arms frantically. "Mom, Dad," Derek called out, turning away from the window. "Mrs. Betty's stuck. She needs help." Marie rushed over, her face pale. She looked out the window, her eyes widening. "Oh my God," she whispered. She turned to Marcus. "We have to do something." Marcus shook his head, his expression grim. "It's too dangerous. We can't risk it." Derek looked back at Mrs. Betty. The water was rising fast and she was starting to panic. He knew they didn't have much time. He turned to his mom. "I have to help her," he said, his voice steady. "No, Derek, you can't." Marie grabbed his arm, her eyes filling with tears. "It's too dangerous, please don't." Derek swallowed hard, looking at his mom, then back at Mrs. Betty. He knew the risks, but he also knew he couldn't just stand there and do nothing. He pulled away from his mom's grip, his heart pounding. "I have to try," he said. Without another word, he turned and ran for the door, his mom's voice calling after him, pleading with him to stay. He ignored it, pushing the door open and stepping out into the storm. The cold water rushed around his ankles, then his knees, as he waded into the street, his eyes fixed on Mrs. Betty. "Hang on!" he shouted, fighting against the current. "I'm coming!" The water was stronger than he expected, pushing him back with every step. He stumbled, nearly losing his balance, but he kept going, his eyes locked on Mrs. Betty, who was now clinging to the porch railing, her face pale with fear. "Derek!" his mom screamed from the doorway, her voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. "Come back!" But Derek didn't stop. He couldn't. He had to help. The rain pounded harder, drumming against the flooded street as Derek fought to keep his balance. The water was cold, biting into his skin, and each step felt like a battle. His sneakers slipped on the pavement beneath him, and he had to grab onto a mailbox to steady himself. Mrs. Betty was still on her porch, her arms wrapped around a post as the water rose to her waist. "Derek, you shouldn't be out here," she shouted, her voice hoarse with fear. Her face was streaked with rain, her eyes wide as she watched him fight his way toward her. "I'm gonna get you out," Derek called back, his voice strained. He pushed forward, each step bringing a new wave that threatened to knock him over. He couldn't think about how dangerous it was. He just focused on putting one foot in front of the other. A sharp gust of wind ripped through the street, carrying branches and debris with it. Derek ducked as a piece of plywood sailed past him, narrowly missing his head. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to keep going, to push through the exhaustion that was already settling into his muscles. When he finally reached Mrs. Betty's porch, He could see the fear etched in her wrinkled face. She was shivering, her hands trembling as she tried to hold onto the post. "I'm here, Mrs. Betty," he said, reaching out to her. "We gotta get out of here now." She shook her head, her teeth chattering. I can't, Derek. I'm too scared," she stammered, her voice cracking. Derek grabbed her arm gently, looking her in the eyes. "You can do this. I'm not leaving without you. We're getting out of here together," he said firmly. He could hear the desperation in his own voice, the fear that if they waited any longer, it would be too late. Mrs. Betty hesitated, then slowly nodded. She let go of the porch post, and Derek pulled her toward him, her frail body trembling as she leaned against him. The water swirled around them, and Derek took a deep breath, bracing himself for the struggle ahead. "We're gonna go slow, okay? One step at a time," he said, trying to keep his voice steady for her sake. He wrapped an arm around her waist, supporting her weight as they moved off the porch and into the flooded street. The current was stronger now, pushing against them with a force that made it hard to keep their footing. Derek gritted his teeth, his muscles straining as he took a step, then another, guiding Mrs. Betty forward. The cold water surged around their legs, and he could feel the panic rising in his chest. "Just keep moving, Mrs. Betty. I've got you," he said, trying to reassure her, even though he wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on himself. Suddenly, Mrs. Betty stumbled, her foot catching on something beneath the water. She let out a cry, and they both went down, the current pulling them under. Derek's head went under, the cold water rushing into his nose and mouth. He gasped, kicking his legs frantically, trying to get back to the surface. He broke through, coughing and sputtering, his arms still wrapped around Mrs. Betty. She was panicking, her arms flailing as she struggled to stay afloat. Derek tightened his grip on her, pulling her up until she could breathe again. "It's okay. I've got you," he shouted, his voice rough from the cold. He could feel her trembling against him, her breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. He knew they couldn't keep going like this. They needed to find somewhere safe, and fast. He looked around, squinting through the rain, trying to find anything they could use to hold on to. Across the street, he saw a sturdy-looking fence, partially submerged but still standing. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Mrs. Betty, we're going to head for that fence," he said, pointing it out to her. She nodded weakly, too exhausted to speak. Derek took a deep breath, tightening his arm around her again. He took a step, the water pushing against him, trying to drag them both away. He fought it, one step at a time, his legs burning with the effort. Mrs. Betty leaned heavily against him, her breath coming in shallow gasps. When they finally reached the fence, Derek grabbed it with his free hand, holding on as tightly as he could. He pulled Mrs. Betty in close, letting her lean against the fence as she tried to catch her breath. "We're going to stay here for a bit, okay?" he said, his voice shaky. He was breathing hard, his whole body aching from the effort of getting them this far. Mrs. Betty nodded, her eyes closed, her face pale. She was shivering, her hands gripping the fence with all the strength she had left. Derek looked around, trying to figure out what to do next. The water was still rising, and they couldn't stay here forever. They needed to get to higher ground. In the distance, he saw the outline of a 2-story house, the top floor still above water. It was further than he wanted to go, but it was their best shot. He swallowed hard, knowing they didn't have any other choice. "Mrs. Betty, we're going to try for that house," he said, pointing it out to her. She opened her eyes, looking at the house, then at Derek. She nodded slowly, though her expression was filled with doubt. Derek took a deep breath, bracing himself for the next part of their journey. He couldn't let himself think about how hard it was going to be. He just had to do it. He looked at Mrs. Betty, giving her what he hoped was a reassuring smile. "Just stay with me, okay? We're going to make it," he said. He took her arm again, and they pushed away from the fence, moving toward the house. The current was even stronger now, the water up to Derek's chest. He could feel it pulling at him, trying to drag him down. Mrs. Betty was barely able to move on her own, and he was practically carrying her, his muscles screaming with the effort. Step by step, they moved through the flooded street, the rain pounding down on them. Derek could feel his strength fading, his body growing weaker with every passing second. He clenched his jaw, refusing to give in to the exhaustion. He couldn't stop. Not now. Just a little further, he said, though he wasn't sure if Mrs. Betty could even hear him anymore. She was barely conscious, her head resting against his shoulder, her body limp. Derek's feet slipped on the pavement, and he went down again, the water closing over his head. He kicked, pushing himself back up, gasping for air. His vision was blurry, his head pounding, but he kept moving. He had to. Finally, they reached the steps of the house. Derek nearly collapsed as he pulled Mrs. Betty up onto the porch, the water swirling around them. He dragged her up the steps, onto the dry wooden floor, and they both lay there, gasping for breath. Derek rolled onto his back, staring up at the rain-soaked sky. His whole body hurt, his muscles trembling from the effort. But they were alive. They had made it. Mrs. Betty let out a weak laugh, her voice barely a whisper. "You did it, Derek. You saved me," she said, her eyes filled with tears. Derek looked over at her, a tired smile tugging at his lips. "We're not out of this yet, Mrs. Betty. But we're going to be okay," he said, his voice raw. They stayed there on the porch, catching their breath, the storm still raging around them. Derek knew they had to get inside, to find somewhere safe to wait for help. But for now, just for a moment, he let himself rest. Derek sat up, his whole body sore and stiff. The rain still pounded down, but he was grateful to be on the porch above the raging water. Mrs. Betty was beside him, breathing heavily, her face pale and her hands still trembling. He glanced toward the door of the house they were on, hoping it wasn't locked. "Okay, Mrs. Betty," he said, standing up, his legs shaky beneath him. "We need to get inside, somewhere dry." Mrs. Betty nodded, her eyes barely open, exhaustion taking over her entire body. Derek moved to the door, trying the handle. It wouldn't budge. Locked. He cursed under his breath, frustration boiling in his chest. They needed to get inside, out of the cold, before they both got even weaker. He took a step back and rammed his shoulder against the door. It rattled, but didn't give. He tried again, ignoring the sharp pain shooting through his arm. It still wouldn't budge. He looked around, spotting a flower pot nearby. Without thinking, he grabbed it, smashing it against the window next to the door. The glass shattered, and he used his sleeve to clear out the remaining shards. "Come on, Mrs. Betty," he said, reaching down to help her up. She was weak, barely able to stand, but with his help, she climbed through the window, stumbling inside. Derek followed, landing on the floor beside her, his knees hitting the wood hard. They were in the living room of the house, furniture overturned and water pooling on the floor from the broken window. It looked like whoever lived here had left in a hurry. Derek helped Mrs. Betty to the couch, her body slumping as she sat down, her breathing ragged. "Just rest here for a minute, okay?" he said, kneeling beside her. She nodded, closing her eyes, her head leaning back against the cushions. Derek could see how much the ordeal had taken out of her. She was frail, her skin pale, her hands trembling in her lap. He stood up, looking around the room. They needed to find dry clothes, blankets, anything to keep them warm. The air was cold, and with the rain still coming down outside, he knew they couldn't afford to stay wet for long. He moved through the house, opening doors, searching for anything that could help. In one of the bedrooms, he found a closet with some old blankets. He grabbed a couple, wrapping one around his shoulders and taking the other back to Mrs. Betty. He draped it over her, tucking it around her small frame. She stirred, opening her eyes slightly. "Thank you, Derek," she whispered, her voice weak. He gave her a small smile, nodding. "We're going to be okay, Mrs. Betty," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure. He just needed to keep her calm, keep her from panicking. The storm was still raging outside, and the water was rising. He could hear it lapping against the side of the house, the current strong and unyielding. Suddenly, the sound of something crashing outside made him jump. He rushed to the window, looking out. A section of a nearby fence had broken loose, floating down the street, smashing into anything in its path. The water was higher now, almost to the porch. He turned back to Mrs. Betty. "We need to get higher up," he said, his voice tense. He moved over to her, helping her stand, her body shaky under his hands. "Come on, let's get upstairs." They moved slowly, Derek practically carrying her as they climbed the stairs. Each step was a struggle, Mrs. Betty's feet barely lifting off the ground. Derek's legs ached, his muscles screaming from the effort, but he pushed through, focusing on getting her to safety. When they reached the top of the stairs, Derek led her into a bedroom, setting her down on the bed. She lay back, her eyes closing, her chest rising and falling with each labored breath. He pulled the blanket tighter around her, then moved to the window, looking out at the street below. The water was everywhere, the street completely submerged. He could see debris floating by, pieces of fences, branches, even a garbage can. It was chaos. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. They were safe for now, but he didn't know how long it would last. He heard Mrs. Betty mumble something behind him, and he turned back to her. She was looking at him, her eyes tired but focused. "My grandson. He's supposed to come by tomorrow," she said, her voice barely audible. Derek nodded, moving back to her side. "We'll be okay until then," he said. "We just need to hold on for a little longer." She gave him a weak smile, her eyes closing again. Derek sat beside her, his body finally starting to relax. The adrenaline was wearing off, and he could feel the exhaustion settling in, his muscles heavy and sore. He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, just to rest. He could hear the storm still raging outside, the wind howling, the rain pounding against the side of the house. But for now they were safe. They were out of the water, away from the rising flood. Suddenly, there was a loud creak, and the whole house seemed to shudder. Derek's eyes snapped open, his heart pounding in his chest. He jumped up, rushing to the window. The water was higher now, almost to the top of the porch steps. The current was fierce, and he could see pieces of debris slamming against the house, making it shake. He turned back to Mrs. Betty, panic rising in his chest. "We need to be ready to move again," he said, his voice shaking. He moved over to her, helping her sit up, her eyes wide with fear. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The water's still rising," he said, glancing back at the window. "We just need to be ready, in case we need to move again." Mrs. Betty nodded, her hands gripping the blanket tightly. Derek could see the fear in her eyes, and he felt it too. The storm was relentless, and he didn't know how much more the house could take. He moved to the door, looking out into the hallway. They needed an escape plan, just in case. He spotted a small attic door in the ceiling, a pull string hanging down. He reached up, grabbing the string and pulling it down, the ladder unfolding. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He turned back to Mrs. Betty. "If the water gets any higher, we're going to head up to the attic, okay?" he said. She nodded, her eyes wide, her breathing fast. Derek moved back to her, sitting down beside her on the bed. He could feel his own fear, the uncertainty of what was going to happen. But he knew he couldn't let it take over. He had to stay calm, for Mrs. Betty's sake. "We're going to be okay," he said, his voice steady. "We're going to get through this." Mrs. Betty looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, Derek," she whispered. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Derek shook his head, a small smile on his lips. "I'm not going to leave you, Mrs. Betty. We're in this together." They sat there, the storm raging outside, the house creaking and groaning under the pressure of the water. Derek knew they weren't out of danger yet, but for now, they had each other. and that was enough. Derek felt the exhaustion deep in his bones. His whole body ached from the strain, and his eyes were heavy. But the fear in Mrs. Betty's face kept him moving. He couldn't let her down. He had promised they'd get through this, and he meant it. He moved to the window, looking out at the chaotic scene outside. The water was still rising, inching higher and higher, swallowing up the street below. It was hard to believe that just a few hours ago, this had all been normal. A quiet neighborhood, people in their homes. Now, everything was underwater. The storm raged on, and he could hear the howling of the wind as it ripped through the neighborhood, sending debris flying in all directions. A sudden crash from downstairs made Derek jump. He ran out of the room and peered over the railing, his heart pounding. The front door had given way, and water was pouring into the house, filling the first floor. Derek clenched his jaw. They didn't have much time. He rushed back into the room, his breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. "Mrs. Betty, we gotta go up to the attic now," he said, grabbing her hand and helping her off the bed. She was weak, her legs barely able to hold her up, but she nodded, her face set with determination. Together they moved toward the attic ladder. Derek climbed up first, pulling himself into the small, dark space. He reached down, taking Mrs. Betty's hand and helping her up. She struggled, her arms shaking, but Derek pulled her through, making sure she was safe. The attic was cramped and dusty, the air heavy and stale. Derek turned on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. He looked around, searching for anything they could use to make themselves more comfortable. There wasn't much, just some old boxes and a few pieces of furniture covered in sheets. He helped Mrs. Betty to a small corner, wrapping the blanket tighter around her. She looked up at him, her eyes tired but grateful. "You're doing so good, Derek," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Your parents must be so proud of you." Derek swallowed hard, a lump forming in his throat. He hoped they were okay. He hoped they understood why he had to do this. He pushed the thought away, focusing on the moment. They had to stay strong. They had to survive this. He moved to the small attic window, looking out. The water was rising fast, and he could see parts of houses floating down the street. It was surreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. He could hear the wind howling, the rain pounding on the roof, and he knew they were running out of time. Mrs. Betty shivered, her frail body trembling in the cold. Derek moved back to her, wrapping his arm around her shoulders, trying to keep her warm. "We're going to get through this," he said, his voice steady. "We just got to hold on a little longer." She nodded, her eyes closing, her head resting on his shoulder. They sat there, the minutes stretching into hours, the storm raging around them. Derek's body ached, his muscles sore from the effort of getting them this far, but he refused to let himself rest. He had to stay alert, had to be ready for whatever came next. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the attic, and Derek's heart jumped into his throat. He turned, the flashlight beam darting across the room. A section of the ceiling had caved in, water pouring in through the gap. He could see the dark sky above, the storm relentless. "Stay here," he said to Mrs. Betty, his voice tight with fear. He moved to the other side of the attic, grabbing a piece of wood and shoving it over the hole, trying to block the water. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. He couldn't let the attic flood. Not now. Mrs. Betty let out a weak cough, and Derek rushed back to her side. Her breathing was labored, her eyes barely open. He could see how much this was taking out of her, and it scared him. She was strong, but she was old, and the cold was getting to her. He grabbed another blanket from one of the boxes, wrapping it around her. "Just hold on, okay? We're going to be all right," he said, his voice breaking. She looked up at him, her eyes glassy, and she gave him a weak smile. "You're a good boy, Derek," she whispered. "Don't you ever forget that." Derek swallowed, nodding. He didn't feel like a good boy. He felt scared, helpless. but he couldn't show it, not to her. He had to be strong for both of them. Hours passed, and the storm didn't let up. Derek kept his arm around Mrs. Betty, trying to keep her warm, trying to keep her calm. He could hear the water rising below them, the creaking of the house as it struggled against the force of the flood. Suddenly, a faint noise caught his attention, a distant rumble. He turned, listening. It was different from the wind, different from the rain. It was rhythmic, steady. His heart leaped in his chest as he realized what it was. A helicopter. He scrambled to the window, his eyes scanning the dark sky. He could see a faint light in the distance, the sound growing louder. He turned back to Mrs. Betty, excitement and fear mixing in his chest. "Mrs. Betty, they're coming. They're going to find us," he said, his voice trembling. She opened her eyes, a flicker of hope crossing her face. "You think they'll see us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Derek nodded, grabbing the flashlight. He moved to the small window, opening it and leaning out. The wind whipped at his face, the rain stinging his skin, but he didn't care. He waved the flashlight back and forth, the beam cutting through the darkness. "Over here! We're here!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. The helicopter drew closer, the light growing brighter. He could see it now, the searchlight scanning the flooded streets below. He kept waving the flashlight, his arm aching, his heart pounding. "Please see us," he whispered, his breath hitching. He watched as the helicopter turned, the spotlight moving in their direction. His chest tightened as the light moved closer, illuminating the house. "They see us!" he shouted, turning back to Mrs. Betty, his face breaking into a smile. She let out a weak laugh, tears filling her eyes. The helicopter hovered above, and Derek watched as a rescuer was lowered down, a harness strapped to their body. Derek's heart raced as he moved to the attic opening, shouting to the rescuer below. The man looked up, giving him a thumbs up, signaling that he saw them. Derek turned back to Mrs. Betty, his eyes filling with tears of relief. "We're going to be okay, Mrs. Betty. They're going to get us out of here," he said, his voice shaking. She nodded, her face breaking into a tired smile. "I knew you'd get us through this, Derek," she whispered. The rescuer climbed up into the attic, his face serious but calm. He moved to Mrs. Betty, securing the harness around her. Derek watched, his chest tight with a mix of fear and relief. They were finally getting out. The rescuer looked at Derek. "We'll come back for you, kid. Hang tight," he said, his voice muffled by the storm. Derek nodded, watching as Mrs. Betty was lifted out of the attic, her frail body held securely by the harness. He moved to the window, watching as she was lifted into the helicopter, the light illuminating her small frame. Tears filled his eyes as he watched her disappear into the helicopter, her face turned toward him, a look of gratitude in her eyes. Derek took a deep breath, wiping his face. He knew they weren't out of danger yet, but for the first time since the storm started, he felt a glimmer of hope. He turned back to the attic, the rescuer signaling that they were ready to lower the harness for him. Derek took a deep breath, his heart pounding. He looked out at the storm one last time, the water still rising, the wind still howling. He knew this wasn't over, but he also knew they had made it through the worst. He had kept his promise to Mrs. Betty. They were going to be okay. The harness felt heavy around Derek's chest, the straps digging into his shoulders as the rescuer secured it tightly. He looked up, his heart pounding as he prepared himself to be lifted. The storm outside was still roaring, the wind slamming against the house with enough force to make it groan and sway. But he knew he had to keep it together, just a little more, and they'd be safe. The rescuer gave a thumbs up, and Derek felt the harness pull taut, lifting him off the floor. His stomach flipped as he was pulled up, his feet leaving the attic's wooden boards. He grabbed onto the straps, holding on as they were lifted out of the attic window. The rain hit him immediately, cold and biting, soaking his skin. He squinted against it, his eyes stinging as he tried to see through the downpour. The helicopter's spotlight blazed through the darkness, illuminating the flooded street below. Derek could see the swirling waters, the debris drifting along, broken fences, bits of furniture, trash cans. Everything had become a part of this massive, chaotic river. He gulped, his throat dry despite the rain pouring down on him. It was unreal and terrifying. The helicopter was directly overhead now, the noise deafening. Derek could barely hear anything else. The wind, the rain, all drowned out by the roar of the helicopter blades. He squeezed his eyes shut, his grip on the harness tightening as they continued to lift him. When they finally pulled him into the helicopter, strong hands grabbed him, helping him inside. He collapsed against the floor, his chest heaving, his whole body shaking from the cold and the adrenaline. He turned his head, and his eyes found Mrs. Betty. She was strapped to the seat, a blanket around her shoulders, her eyes watching him. She gave him a weak smile, her eyes filled with relief. "You made it," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise of the helicopter. Derek nodded, his own lips curving into a smile. "We made it," he said, his voice cracking from the cold. He pushed himself up, moving to sit beside her. The rescuer handed him a blanket, and he wrapped it around himself, trying to get warm. The helicopter lurched and Derek grabbed onto the seat, his stomach flipping. Mrs. Betty reached over, her hand resting on his arm. "You did good, Derek. You saved me," she said, her voice trembling. Derek looked at her, the words catching in his throat. He didn't know what to say. He just nodded, giving her a small smile. The helicopter moved away from the neighborhood, and Derek watched as the flooded streets disappeared beneath them. He could see the tops of houses. The streets turned into rivers. The destruction that the storm had left behind. It was hard to believe that this was his home. Everything looked so different, like a place he no longer recognized. After a while, the helicopter began to descend, and Derek could see a landing zone below. Emergency vehicles, flashing lights, people moving around in bright raincoats. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. It wasn't over yet, but they were one step closer to safety. The helicopter landed, and the door slid open. The noise of the blades was deafening, the wind whipping around them. Rescuers rushed forward, helping Mrs. Betty out first. Derek followed, his legs shaky as he climbed out of the helicopter. The ground felt solid beneath his feet, and he let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. A medic rushed over, guiding them toward a tent where others were gathered. Derek looked around, his eyes scanning the crowd, hoping to see a familiar face. He knew his parents would be worried. They had watched him go out into the storm, watched him risk his life. He just wanted to find them, to let them know he was okay. Mrs. Betty was taken to one side of the tent, a medic checking her over, wrapping her in more blankets. Derek stood there, unsure of where to go, his eyes still scanning the area. The tent was full of people, some crying, some injured, all of them with the same look of exhaustion and fear. He heard someone calling his name and his head snapped up. "Derek!" He turned and his heart skipped a beat. His mother was pushing her way through the crowd, her face pale, her eyes wide with panic. She saw him, and her face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. She rushed over, pulling him into a tight hug, her arms wrapping around him as if she would never let go. "Mom," Derek whispered, his own eyes filling with tears. He hugged her back, burying his face in her shoulder. I'm okay, he said, his voice cracking. Marie pulled back, her hands on his face, her eyes searching his. "I was so scared, Derek. I thought—" She stopped, her voice breaking. She pulled him into another hug, her body shaking with sobs. Derek hugged her back, his own chest tightening. He knew how scared she must have been. He had been scared too. His dad was there too, his face tight with emotion. He put his hand on Derek's shoulder, giving it a squeeze. "You did good, son. You did real good," he said, his voice gruff. Derek looked at him, the words catching in his throat. He just nodded, his eyes stinging. They stayed there for a moment, just holding each other, the chaos of the tent fading into the background. Derek felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him, his body finally starting to give in to the weariness that had been building for hours. His dad noticed, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "Come on, let's get you checked out," Marcus said, guiding him toward one of the medics. Derek nodded, leaning on his dad, his legs feeling like they could give out at any moment. The medic sat him down, checking his vitals, asking him questions, but it all felt like a blur. He kept looking over at Mrs. Betty, who was now lying on a cot, her eyes closed, her face peaceful. She looked so small, so fragile, but she was alive, and that was all that mattered. The medic finished, giving Derek a blanket and a bottle of water. "You're lucky, kid," he said, his voice kind. "Not everyone made it out tonight." Derek nodded, his throat tight. He looked down at the blanket in his hands, his fingers trembling. He knew how close they had come to not making it, how close he had come to losing Mrs. Betty, to losing himself. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. His mom sat down beside him, her arm around his shoulders. "You saved her, Derek. You saved her life," she said, her voice filled with pride. Derek looked over at Mrs. Betty, his chest tightening. He thought about the moments when he had almost given up, when he had almost let the fear take over. But he hadn't. He had kept going, for her. He nodded, leaning his head against his mom's shoulder. "Yeah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We made it." They sat there, the chaos of the tent around them, the rain still falling outside. Derek closed his eyes, letting the exhaustion take over. For the first time since the storm had started, he felt safe. He had done it. He had saved her, and now finally, they could rest. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale, grayish light over the makeshift emergency camp. The rain had finally stopped, and the sky was clearing, the thick clouds giving way to patches of blue. Derek blinked, adjusting his eyes to the early light. He was wrapped in a blanket, seated on the edge of a cot, his body heavy with exhaustion. Around him, people moved slowly, medics checking on those who had been rescued, volunteers handing out food and supplies. Derek took a deep breath, the cold morning air filling his lungs. His mom was beside him, sitting on the grass, her eyes puffy from crying but filled with relief. She had refused to leave his side all night, her arm wrapped around his shoulders. Marcus was pacing nearby, talking to a volunteer, trying to figure out what their next steps would be. "Mom," Derek said, his voice rough from fatigue. Marie turned to him, her eyes softening. "I need to check on Mrs. Betty," he said. He was worried. He hadn't been able to talk to her since they'd arrived. The medics had taken her to a separate area, and he just wanted to know that she was okay. Marie nodded, giving him a small smile. "Of course, sweetheart, let's go see her," she said. She stood up, helping Derek to his feet. His legs wobbled beneath him, his muscles aching, but he pushed through it. He needed to see Mrs. Betty. They moved slowly through the camp, weaving through clusters of people, makeshift tents, and piles of supplies. The place was filled with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Families reunited, people resting after a long night of uncertainty. When they reached the medical tent, Derek spotted Mrs. Betty almost immediately. She was sitting up on her cot, a nurse by her side, a cup of water in her hands. She looked frail, her hair disheveled, her face lined with exhaustion, but she was smiling. "Mrs. Betty," Derek called, his heart lifting at the sight of her awake and alert. She turned her head, her eyes lighting up as soon as she saw him. "Derek," she said, her voice trembling. She set the cup down, holding out her arms, and Derek hurried over, wrapping her in a gentle hug. "You okay?" he asked, his voice cracking. He pulled back, looking at her, his eyes scanning her face for any sign of pain. She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "Thanks to you, sweetheart. You saved me," she said, her voice filled with emotion. She reached up, cupping his cheek, her hand trembling. "You're my hero, Derek. I don't know what I would have done without you." Derek swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He didn't know what to say. He had just done what he had to do. He hadn't thought of himself as a hero. He had been scared the whole time, unsure if he could even get them out alive. But hearing Mrs. Betty say those words made everything feel worth it. He gave her a small smile, his eyes wet. "I couldn't leave you," he said simply. "We had to get out together." Mrs. Betty nodded, her eyes glistening. "And we did," she said softly. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "You've got a brave heart, Derek. Your parents should be so proud of you." Marie stepped closer, her eyes filled with tears as she listened. "We are, Mrs. Betty," she said, her voice trembling. "We're so proud of him." Derek glanced back at his mom, and she gave him a nod, her eyes full of warmth. He smiled, feeling a mixture of pride and relief. It was over. They had survived the night, and they were all here to see the morning light. "Derek, come here for a second," Marcus called from across the tent. He waved Derek over, his expression serious. Derek turned to Mrs. Betty, giving her hand a final squeeze. "I'll be right back, okay?" he said. Mrs. Betty nodded, her eyes still wet. "Go on, sweetheart." "I'll be here," she said, her voice soft. Derek made his way over to his dad, Marie following behind him. Marcus stood with a tall man, wearing a raincoat and holding a clipboard. The man smiled when he saw Derek, his eyes kind. "You must be Derek," the man said, extending his hand. Derek shook it, confused. "My name's Thomas. I'm with the city's rescue coordination. I just wanted to meet you, young man. I heard about what you did last night, helping Mrs. Betty. That took a lot of courage." Derek glanced at his dad, who gave him an encouraging nod. He looked back at Thomas, shrugging. I had to help her. I couldn't leave her," he said, his voice quiet. Thomas smiled. "Well, that's the kind of attitude that saves lives," he said. He reached into his coat, pulling out a small envelope. "This is for you. It's not much, but it's a little something from the community. A thank you for your bravery." Derek stared at the envelope, his brow furrowing. He took it, glancing up at Thomas. I don't need anything," he said, his voice hesitant. Thomas shook his head, smiling. "It's not about what you need, son. It's about recognizing what you did. You risked your life for someone else, and that's something we want to honor," he said. Derek looked down at the envelope, his fingers brushing over the seal. He didn't know what to say. He looked up at his dad, who gave him a proud nod, his eyes soft. "Thank you," Derek said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas nodded, giving him a pat on the shoulder. "You take care of yourself, Derek, and if you or your family need anything, you let us know," he said. He turned, giving Marcus a nod before walking away. Derek looked down at the envelope in his hands, his mind swirling. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. He just wanted things to go back to normal, to go home, to make sure his family was okay. He looked at his dad, then at his mom, who was smiling at him. "Open it," Marie said gently, her eyes filled with curiosity. Derek hesitated, then carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a note, handwritten, thanking him for his bravery. And there was something else. A gift card, a decent amount, enough to help his family. His eyes widened, and he looked up at his parents, his mouth open in surprise. Marcus let out a low whistle, his eyebrows raising. "Looks like you just got us a little bit of breathing room, kid," he said, his voice filled with pride. Marie wrapped her arm around Derek's shoulders, pulling him close. "We'll use it wisely," she said softly, her eyes misting over. "You've helped more than you know, Derek." Derek took a deep breath, his heart swelling with emotion. He hadn't expected any of this. He had just wanted to help Mrs. Betty, to do what he knew was right. And now, somehow, it felt like things might actually start to get better for his family. They stood there, the early morning sun slowly warming the camp, people moving around them. Derek looked back at Mrs. Betty, who was resting in her cot, a peaceful smile on her face. He felt a sense of calm, a sense of relief that he hadn't felt in a long time. He knew they weren't out of the woods yet. They still had a lot to figure out, a lot to rebuild. But for the first time in a long time, Derek felt hope. Real hope that things could change, that they could get better. He looked at his mom and dad, their faces tired but proud, and he smiled. "We're going to be okay," he said, his voice steady. Marie nodded, her eyes glistening. "Yes, we are," she said. Derek took one last look at the camp, the people around them, the brightening sky above. The storm had tried to tear everything apart, but they had made it through. And now, they had a chance to rebuild. And this time, they were going to do it together. Derek's feet sank into the muddy ground as they made their way back to the neighborhood. The air was filled with the smell of damp earth and debris, the sun finally breaking through the clouds, shining down on the destruction left behind. His father walked ahead, his shoulders squared, his face tense. His mother held Kayla's hand tightly, keeping her close as they navigated the debris-strewn streets. Their neighborhood was unrecognizable. Houses were ruined, some half submerged in water, others with their windows blown out and their roofs sagging. The street was covered in a thick layer of mud, scattered with broken branches, pieces of fences, and remnants of people's lives. Derek's stomach twisted as they turned the corner, his eyes locking onto what was left of their home. The front yard was a mess of debris, the door barely hanging on its hinges, the water line visible halfway up the front wall. Marie let out a small gasp, her hand flying to her mouth as they approached. Marcus stopped, staring at the house, his face set in a hard line. Derek swallowed, a heavy feeling settling in his chest. It's still standing," Marcus said finally, his voice rough. He looked back at Marie and Derek, giving them a small nod, trying to be hopeful. "That's something." Marie nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. She moved forward, stepping carefully up the front steps, her feet squelching in the mud. She pushed the door open and it creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty house. Derek followed, his heart pounding as he stepped inside. The living room was a disaster. Furniture was overturned, water had soaked the carpet, and the walls were stained and peeling. Kayla clung to their mother, her eyes wide, her little body trembling. "Mommy, where's all my stuff?" she asked, her voice small and scared. Marie knelt down, pulling Kayla into a hug. "It's okay, sweetheart, we're gonna fix it, all right? We're gonna make it all better," she said, her voice trembling. She looked up at Marcus, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. Derek took a deep breath, moving further into the house. The kitchen was in disarray, cabinets hanging open, their contents spilled onto the counters, water still dripping from the ceiling. He clenched his jaw, pushing down the feeling of helplessness that threatened to rise up in his chest. They moved through the house together, taking in the damage. It was overwhelming. So much was ruined, so much had been lost. But there were moments of hope, too. A family photo that had somehow stayed dry on a high shelf, Kayla's stuffed bunny that they found wedged between the couch cushions. Little things that reminded them that not everything had been taken. Marcus let out a sigh, rubbing a hand over his face. "We've got our work cut out for us," he said, his voice tired but resolute. He looked at Derek, giving him a small smile. "But we're still standing. That's what matters." Derek nodded, his eyes scanning the living room. He knew it was going to be a long road. They'd have to clean up, rebuild, figure out what to do next. But they were together, and that was more than a lot of people had right now. They spent the rest of the day salvaging what they could, sorting through the wreckage, trying to make some sense of the mess left behind. Derek worked alongside his dad, lifting furniture, moving debris, trying to clear a path through the house. His muscles ached, his body tired, but he kept moving, focusing on the task in front of him. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood, Derek stepped out onto the front porch, wiping the sweat from his forehead. He looked down the street, watching as neighbors worked together, pulling debris from yards, talking in low voices, offering each other help. There was a sense of unity, a sense of determination to rebuild, no matter how hard it seemed. He was about to head back inside when he noticed a group of reporters down the street. They were talking to people, their cameras aimed at the damaged houses, capturing the devastation. Derek frowned, his stomach twisting. He didn't want to be on camera. He didn't want to be a story. "Derek," his mom called from inside, her voice tired but warm. "Come in, sweetheart. Let's take a break." He turned, giving one last glance at the reporters before heading back inside. His mom was sitting at the kitchen table, a few salvaged dishes in front of her. Kayla was asleep on the couch, her stuffed bunny clutched in her arms. Marcus was at the stove, trying to get their old camp stove working to heat up some canned food. Derek sat down beside his mom, resting his head in his hands. He felt the weight of everything pressing down on him, the exhaustion, the worry, the uncertainty of what came next. Marie reached over, resting her hand on his back, rubbing small circles. "It's going to be okay," she said softly, her voice filled with the kind of reassurance only a mother could give. "We're going to get through this." Derek looked up at her, his eyes filled with doubt. "How, Mom?" he asked, his voice cracking. "How are we supposed to fix all this? We don't have anything." Marie's eyes softened, and she leaned over, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "We have each other, and we're not alone," she said, nodding toward the street. "Look at everyone out there. We're going to help each other. We're going to rebuild, one step at a time." Marcus turned, a small smile on his face as he held up a can of beans. "And it starts with dinner," he said, trying to lighten the mood. Derek let out a small laugh, shaking his head. His dad always knew how to make him smile, even when things seemed impossible. He watched as Marcus poured the beans into a pot, setting it on the camp stove, the small flame flickering. They sat together, eating their simple meal, the house quiet except for the sound of Kayla's soft breathing and the occasional creak of the floorboards. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They were here, they were alive, and they were together. After they finished eating, Marcus stood, stretching his arms over his head. "We'll start fresh tomorrow," he said, his voice steady. "We'll get some help from the neighbors, see what we can do. But for tonight, let's just rest." Marie nodded, her eyes closing for a moment as she leaned back in her chair. "That sounds good," she said, her voice filled with exhaustion. Derek looked around the dimly lit room, the walls bare, the floor still damp from the flood. It wasn't much, but it was home. He knew it was going to take time, that they had a lot of work ahead of them. But as he looked at his mom and dad, at his little sister asleep on the couch, he felt a sense of determination. They were going to make it. They were going to rebuild piece by piece, no matter how long it took. The night settled in, dark and quiet, the air cool as the family lay down to rest, blankets spread out on the floor. Derek closed his eyes, his body aching, his mind tired. But as he listened to the soft breathing of his family around him, he felt a sense of peace. They had lost so much, but they still had each other, and that was enough to start again. The next morning, the sunlight streamed through the broken windows, bright and warm. Derek blinked awake, his body still aching from the day before. He could hear his dad outside, talking to someone, the voices low and steady. Kayla was still asleep, curled up under the blanket with her stuffed bunny tucked close to her chest. His mom was up, cleaning up some of the mess in the kitchen. Derek pushed himself to his feet, stretching out his sore muscles. He could hear Marcus talking with someone outside, their voices becoming clearer as he made his way to the door. When he stepped onto the porch, he saw his dad standing by the gate, speaking to a tall man in a crisp black suit. The man had a serious expression, and his eyes flickered over to Derek as he walked out. He gave Derek a nod, then turned his attention back to Marcus, saying something in a low voice. There was something about the man that immediately made Derek uneasy. He wasn't dressed like anyone else in the neighborhood. And then, behind him, Derek saw it. A shiny black limousine, parked just down the street. "Derek," Marcus called, waving him over. He glanced at the man, then back at his son. "This gentleman says he's here to speak with you." Derek's brow furrowed, and he walked over slowly, his heart picking up speed. The man in the suit turned, extending a hand to Derek. "You must be Derek," he said, his voice smooth and polite. "My name is Mr. Allen. I'm here on behalf of someone who wants to meet you." Derek blinked, taking the man's hand, his mind racing. "Meet me?" he echoed, glancing at his dad, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Who wants to meet me?" Mr. Allen smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Mrs. Betty's grandson," he said. "He heard about what you did during the flood, how you saved his grandmother. He wants to thank you in person." Derek's eyes widened, and he glanced at his dad. Marcus gave him a small smile, resting a hand on his shoulder. "It's okay, son," he said softly. "Go ahead." Derek swallowed, his throat tight. He wasn't sure what to say. He had saved Mrs. Betty because it was the right thing to do, not because he wanted any recognition. He looked back at Mr. Allen, who gestured toward the limousine. "He's waiting in the car," Mr. Allen said. "Shall we?" Derek nodded slowly, following Mr. Allen down the street to the limousine. The door opened as they approached, and Derek saw a young man in his 20s sitting inside, dressed in a neat suit, his eyes kind. He stepped out, giving Derek a warm smile. "You must be Derek," the young man said, extending his hand. "My name is David. I'm Mrs. Betty's grandson." Derek shook his hand, his eyes wide. "Hi, sir," he said, his voice quiet. I didn't expect to see you here." David smiled, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I had to come," he said. "My grandmother told me everything about what happened. She said you saved her life." He paused, his expression growing serious. "I can't thank you enough for what you did. You're a hero, Derek." Derek looked down, his cheeks flushing. "I'm not a hero," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I had to help her." David nodded, his smile softening. "That's what makes you a hero, Derek. You did what most people wouldn't have the courage to do. And because of that, my grandmother is still here." He gestured to the limousine, his eyes meeting Derek's. "I'd like to offer you and your family something, as a way of saying thank you. Can we sit and talk?" Derek hesitated, glancing back at his dad, who stood by the gate, watching. Marcus gave him a nod, and Derek took a deep breath, turning back to David. "Okay," he said. David led him to the limousine, and they both climbed inside. The interior was spacious, the seats made of soft leather. Derek sat awkwardly, his hands resting in his lap, unsure of what to say. David smiled, sensing his discomfort. "Derek, I know you probably don't want anything in return," David said, his voice gentle. "But my grandmother insisted that we do something to help you and your family. You see, she believes that people like you, people who care enough to risk their lives for others, deserve a chance at a better life." Derek looked at him, his brow furrowing. "I don't need anything," he said. "I just wanted to help Mrs. Betty." David nodded, his eyes understanding. "I know, but I still want to offer you something." I'd like to help your family get back on their feet. My grandmother wants to make sure you all have what you need to rebuild after the storm." He paused, then reached into his jacket, pulling out a small envelope. He handed it to Derek, his expression serious. "This is for your family. It's enough to cover some of the repairs to your home and to help you get back on your feet." Derek took the envelope, his hands trembling slightly. He looked down at it, his heart pounding. I don't know what to say," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. David smiled. "You don't have to say anything, Derek. Just promise me you'll use it to help your family. You all deserve a chance at a fresh start." Derek swallowed, nodding slowly. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. It means a lot." David nodded, his eyes soft. "There's one more thing," he said. "I've also set up a scholarship fund for you. If you ever decide you want to continue your education, go to college, it'll be there for you. My grandmother wants you to have every opportunity." Derek's eyes widened, his heart skipping a beat. "A scholarship?" he echoed, his voice barely audible. David nodded. "You're a bright kid, Derek. You deserve a chance to do something great with your life. My grandmother believes in you, and so do I." Derek looked down, his eyes filling with tears. He hadn't even thought about college. It had always seemed so far out of reach, something other kids talked about, but never something for him. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Thank you," he said again, his voice trembling. I don't know how to thank you enough." David smiled, resting a hand on Derek's shoulder. "You already have, Derek. You saved my grandmother, and that's something I can never repay." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything sinking in. Derek felt a mix of emotions: gratitude, disbelief, hope. It was like everything he'd dreamed about but never thought could happen was suddenly within reach. David gave him one last smile before opening the door, stepping out of the limousine. Derek followed, his legs feeling shaky as he climbed out. His dad was waiting by the gate, his eyes filled with questions. David extended his hand to Marcus, giving him a firm handshake. "Thank you for letting me speak with your son, Mr. Thompson," he said. "He's a remarkable young man. You should be very proud." Marcus nodded, his eyes misty as he looked at Derek. "I am," he said quietly. "I really am." David smiled, giving them both a nod before heading back to the limousine. Derek watched as the car pulled away, the shiny black exterior disappearing around the corner. He looked down at the envelope in his hands, his heart pounding. "What's in there, son?" Marcus asked, his voice soft. Derek looked up, his eyes meeting his dad's. He held out the envelope, his hands still trembling. It's money. To help with the house," he said. He took a deep breath, his voice breaking. "And there's a scholarship. For me. For college." Marcus's eyes widened, his face filled with shock. He reached out, taking the envelope from Derek, opening it carefully. He looked down at the contents, then back at his son, his eyes glistening with tears. This is everything, Derek," he said, his voice cracking. "This is a chance for us to start over." Derek nodded, his own eyes filling with tears. He felt his mom's arms wrap around him, pulling him into a hug, her body shaking with emotion. "We're so proud of you," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "You've given us hope, Derek. You've given us a future." They stood there together, the morning sun warming their faces, the promise of a new beginning shining brightly before them. For the first time in a long time, Derek felt like maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. Weeks passed since the flood, and little by little life was beginning to take shape again in the neighborhood. The air was filled with the sounds of people working, hammers striking nails, voices calling out directions, the rumble of trucks bringing in supplies. The chaos had turned into something else. an organized effort to rebuild, to restore what had been lost. Derek stood in front of his house, his eyes scanning the freshly repaired walls. The door had been replaced, the windows were new, and the muddy waterline that had stained the siding was scrubbed clean. It still looked rough in places, but it was theirs, and that was all that mattered. The sense of accomplishment filled him as he ran his hand along the doorframe, feeling the smooth surface. His dad came out from inside, a toolbox in his hands, his eyes bright despite the tired lines on his face. "What do you think, son?" Marcus asked, nodding at the house. Derek smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "It looks great, Dad. I mean, we still have a lot to do, but it's home." Marcus chuckled, giving Derek a pat on the shoulder. "Yeah, it's home," he said. He paused, looking down the street where other neighbors were busy at work. "Feels like everyone's starting over, doesn't it?" Derek nodded, watching as Mr. Johnson worked with a group of volunteers to repair the roof on his house. Across the street, the Smiths were painting their front porch, the laughter of their young children echoing down the block. It felt like the neighborhood was coming alive again, different, maybe a little scarred, but still alive. "Hey, Derek," a voice called, snapping him out of his thoughts. He turned to see Mrs. Betty, her grandson David at her side, both of them making their way toward him. Mrs. Betty was walking slowly, her cane tapping along the ground, her eyes twinkling. Derek's face lit up with a smile, and he hurried over to help her. "Mrs. Betty, David, it's good to see you," he said, his voice filled with warmth. He took Mrs. Betty's arm, guiding her up the steps to the porch. Mrs. Betty beamed at him, her eyes misty. "Oh, sweetheart, it's good to see you too," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I had to come by and see what you've done with the place. It looks wonderful, Derek." David nodded, smiling as he looked around. "You all have done an amazing job. It's incredible to see the neighborhood coming together like this." Derek looked at the house, then back at them, shrugging modestly. "We had a lot of help," he said, "and we're still working on it, but it's getting there." Mrs. Betty patted his arm, her eyes soft. "You should be proud, Derek, not just for what you've done here, but for everything. You're a remarkable young man." Derek felt his cheeks flush, and he looked down, his heart swelling with emotion. He wasn't used to all this praise. It made him feel both proud and a little overwhelmed. "Thank you, Mrs. Betty," he said softly. David cleared his throat, smiling at Derek. "I also wanted to check in on that other thing we talked about," he said, his eyes meeting Derek's. "The scholarship." Derek's eyes widened, his heart skipping a beat. He glanced at his dad, who was now watching them closely, curiosity in his eyes. I haven't really thought much about it yet," Derek admitted. "There's been so much going on, and I've been helping with the house." David nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I get it, but I just wanted you to know there's no rush. It's there for you when you're ready. College, vocational school, whatever you decide. It's your choice." Derek swallowed, his throat tight. The idea of college felt so big, so distant. He had never thought it would be an option for him. But now, with everything David and Mrs. Betty had done, it was real. He could see a future where he wasn't just surviving, but building something more. His dad stepped forward, his eyes misty as he looked at Derek. "It's a big opportunity, son," Marcus said, his voice low. "And no matter what you decide, we're behind you. You deserve this." Derek looked at his dad, then at his mom, who had just stepped outside with Kayla in tow, both of them looking at him with pride in their eyes. Kayla ran over, her stuffed bunny clutched in her hands. Derek, are you going to go to college?" she asked, her voice filled with excitement. Derek chuckled, kneeling down beside her, ruffling her hair. "I don't know, Kayla. Maybe," he said, his voice soft. He looked up at his family, his heart full. "But I do know one thing. I want to make sure you all are okay first. We've got a lot of work to do here, and I'm not going anywhere until we're done." Marcus nodded, his eyes filled with pride. "That's my boy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. David smiled, reaching out to shake Derek's hand. "Whenever you're ready, just give me a call," he said. "And if you need anything at all, you let us know. My grandmother thinks the world of you, and so do I." Mrs. Betty nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "You've got a bright future ahead of you, Derek, and we'll be here cheering you on every step of the way." Derek took a deep breath, his heart swelling with gratitude. He looked at his family, at his neighbors, at Mrs. Betty and David. He felt the warmth of the sun on his face, the promise of a new day. For the first time, he truly believed that things were going to get better. He had a future, a real future, with possibilities he hadn't dared to dream about. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady, filled with determination. "Thank you all. I'm going to make the most of it." They spent the rest of the morning together, talking and laughing, the heavy weight of the past few weeks slowly lifting. Neighbors stopped by, offering to help, sharing stories of what they'd been through. It felt like the neighborhood was more than just a collection of houses now. It was a family, a community that had faced something unimaginable and come out the other side stronger. Later that day, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Derek found himself sitting by the riverbank, watching the water flow past. It was calm now, the surface reflecting the golden glow of the setting sun. He took a deep breath, the cool air filling his lungs, and he let himself relax. He thought back to that night in the storm, the fear, the desperation, the moments when he thought he wouldn't make it. He remembered the weight of Mrs. Betty in his arms, the cold water rising around them, the sound of her voice telling him not to let go. And he hadn't. He had held on, and somehow they had made it through. The river flowed on, and Derek felt a sense of peace settle over him. Life wasn't easy. He knew that now more than ever. But he also knew that he was capable of more than he'd ever imagined. He had faced the storm, and he had come out the other side. And now he was ready for whatever came next. He stood up, brushing the dirt from his jeans, and turned back toward home. His family was waiting for him, the future was waiting for him, and for the first time he felt ready. Ready to take that next step, to build something better, not just for himself, but for everyone who had stood by him. As he walked back, the voices of his family carried on the breeze, laughter, warmth, love. And he smiled, knowing that no matter what, they would face whatever came next together.